Hello and welcome to the Mejlis Podcast, Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Mejlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. We've discussed gender and domestic violence in Central Asia several times on the Mejlis Podcast. Governments in the region pledged to implement and enforce new laws that would better protect women and girls, and they have passed legislation aiming to do just that. Yet shocking stories continue to come out of Central Asia about gender and domestic violence. In Kyrgyzstan, in late September, a woman was brutally attacked and permanently disfigured by her ex-husband. The woman had complained to police several times about the abuse of her former spouse. Her horrific story is sadly only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to gender and domestic violence, and many other stories of official neglect and apathy toward the plight of women have emerged since the attack. Why is the law not working to help curb violence against women and girls? And I need to remind that we're talking about Kyrgyzstan. Media in that country is relatively freer than in other Central Asian countries. The problem of gender and domestic violence is just as bad in these neighboring countries. It just doesn't receive the same amount of coverage. So to discuss all this, I'm joined by Aksana Ismailbekova, a research fellow at the Leibniz-Zentrum-Moderner Orient. Her research work focuses on kinship, migration, ethnicity, patronage, conflict, and gender in Kyrgyzstan. Adina Masalbekova, a Bishkek-based independent researcher focusing on China's engagement with Central Asia. Adina has worked previously with the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, the Australian National University, Global Partners Governance, the Center for European Security Studies, and the OSCE Academy. Leila Seiitbek, a lawyer living in exile in Europe. Leila is the chairwoman of the NGO Freedom for Eurasia and a member of the working group for the Global Treaty to End All Forms of Violence Against Women and Girls. Thank you all for being on the program today. And I want to start by kind of trying to set the table here a little bit so we can understand, what the law is supposed to do for these people. And actually, we can start with anybody here, but to whom should women appeal when they're the victims of abuse or violence? And what are the authorities supposed to do to protect them?
I'll take that. So it should actually be quite simple. The process has to be really simple. There has to be a very simple way for the woman to go to the police, report her situation. Submit a very simple complaint. And of course, there have to be officers trained in handling cases like that would know how to approach the victim, how to speak with the victim, to understand how not to victimize and traumatize the victim further, not to shame and blame the victim, and collect, all necessary material, evidence, schedule an expert sort of checkup, a medical checkup. And then there is also there's actually a whole circle of professionals that come in contact with the victim at that moment. That's also medical professionals. There has to be, of course, a possibility to provide psychological support. There are very simple things also in the process that the government, the authorities can do. They aren't that expensive, actually. Like, for example, a simple possibility for the woman to be able to leave the child somewhere for the time when she files a complaint or goes to the court if her case reaches the court, actually. And this is exactly something that is actually not working in Kyrgyzstan. And I understand that Kyrgyzstan is not the only country where that doesn't really work. There are many places where things like that don't exist. But these are like the golden standards that should be in place for the woman to be able to use. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that in Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to that?
Yes, I would like to jump in to Leila's point. And for this, why this law designed to protect women faces various complex challenges that make it quite ineffective. And in my view, corruption is the main problem, because most of the time husbands intimidate their wives, claiming that they can easily bribe the police, lawyers, court, or they usually threat to take away children and property. And as we know, in most of the case in Kyrgyzstan, property is usually, or any kind of property, whether it's house or car, is registered under husband's parents' name. And the women usually face restrictions in owning or inheriting any kind of property. So there is a real fear for them is being left with children and nowhere to live. And another important point is this domestic violence is considered to be not a police matter, rather purely personal family territory. So, and here we don't see the state that doesn't provide any support, and also women do not trust state anymore. And of course, since a lot of women are given this care responsibility of taking care of children or elderly parents, so most of the time they have less paid positions and they often stay in such relationship because they are quite dependent on their husbands. So there are so many other reasons, but these are the common.
Dina, you have any comment on this?
Yes, but first of all, thank you for having me on this show. I'm a huge fan of the program, and it's really great to have this conversation with amazing people. I think I agree with what Leila and Aksana mentioned, that, well, first of all, it should be not, there shouldn't be measures that are taken to prevent, to fight against those cases, but measures that would prevent those cases. And that would be to start from state institutions, but also there is a cultural thing where domestic violence is, as Aksana mentioned, is normalized and considered as something normal, as something that the police will just tell the victims to why would they even bother to apply and ask for help. And I think there should be also media literacy and a huge work done coming from the young generation. I think all these things that is being showed in the media, showing what domestic abuse is and domestic violence is, I think it also creates some sort of awareness, at least among younger generation, where then they will try to talk to their parents, they will try to talk to their pals and people around them. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to talk about this one specific case just a little bit more because, of course, the poor victim had actually commented that she had called police and complained, and they her quote, I think, was no one heard me. Her abuser was an ex-husband, and she had complained about him already. Once she had dropped the complaint because his family had persuaded her to drop it, but the second time he actually went to court and was convicted. And then at first he was sentenced to prison, but then he ended up getting probation and let go. What I know that we've talked a little bit about the police, but, is this, and you've said this is a common response, but is there any way to push police to actually enforce this, or the court systems to keep people like this in prison?
Well, yes, there has to be a very well orchestrated approach, again, by the authorities. For example, this prevention education is an important thing in fighting against violence against women. And this prevention education has to include all of the population, women and girls, of course, so that they understand what is normal or what is not normal, and to understand how to defend themselves. But also the prevention education should also cover men and boys. And actually, there is a rich body of reports that by experts, also from CEDAW and other specialized organizations that have arrived at a conclusion when they were conducting their research that prevention education, when it starts, when it includes even boys as young as 9 years old, actually leads to a very significant change in thinking and understanding the nature of violence. Also, any programs that would, for example, talk about the conflict resolution in a family, that where, for example, school children, maybe of older age, would be explained, how to basically have a normal relationship and settle conflicts at home. There are, some other approaches as well, such as the training for judges and the police, which is also a big issue in Kyrgyzstan, because when they when they receive cases like that, they not only do they wave them off, they actually, as my colleagues have here already mentioned, they tend to take the side of the perpetrator and not of the victim. We have also seen cases in court where the judge would rule against a 12 or a 13-year-old girl who was raped by older men, and he would actually sit there and find reasons why it was her fault and not theirs. So this prevention education should be a very important part of any strategy if the authorities decide to approach the issue. There is also a big lack of mechanisms for these women to fight for their rights on an international level as well. Unfortunately, we are lacking an actual standalone treaty that would actually address the violence against women and girls as a separate human rights violation. And it's very interesting because this human rights violation is actually one of the most widespread violations on Earth by far, because it concerns a half of the planet's population anywhere in the world, in the West, in the East, doesn't matter. So I'll stop here and maybe I'll jump in with some more comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Aksana, well, if you want to add something, you can add something, but I also have another question here too, that in this case, the perpetrator of this crime, the one that attacked this woman, he was 1 week later, he was actually convicted in court, but for violence against a different ex-wife, right? So what I'm wanted to hear from you is what, the court system, is it kind of like when these are big highlight, when this makes a lot of news, when some incident that's just happened and makes a lot of news, did they then decide to do their job? I mean, he had just been given 1.5 years probation in April for essentially the same crime. And then all of a sudden he got an 8.5 year sentence because he was already in the news. Do you see that? Is the court system just kind of forget, or what happens?
When it comes to the court system, I would like to add that this domestic violence in general is not treated seriously. And for example, a lot of district staff, court or lawyers are all male, and they only get involved very seriously when the incidents happen. And they are more interested in counting numbers or resolved cases, or if there is rape. And so they want to focus on the cases rather than preventing them in the first place. So, and probably the whole court legal system does not treat domestic violence as seriously. And another point that I would like to add is concerning these preventive measures that has been mentioned by Leila. And I was thinking that state also should work closely with mosques, because role of mullahs and imams, at least in their regions, really matter and play a crucial role. Because in the mosque usually less issues related to women's rights are discussed, rather even less words are devoted to family issues. So in many discussions are around how to satisfy the men, that topic frequently emphasized in mosques, and religious leaders, imams, usually convey messages reinforcing this male superiority, suggesting that it's acceptable for a husband to resort to violence if his wife refuses intimacy. So I have been working a lot with Islamic activists and their preventive crisis activities, and a lot of women rights activists told me that when they want to raise the issue domestic violence publicly, they would constantly face resistance from state, from mosques, mainly because imams disapprove female activists advocating for women's rights, labeling them as disruptive and accusing them of promoting Western ideals. And so that even women try to raise these small issues like helping women with a domestic task, they would trigger a lot of negative reactions, even from imam who view them as a challenge to male authority. And definitely in this case, we see that the state is also biased and really see a lot of women's rights issues as a challenge to even power authority.
Okay, thanks. This is an interesting point, too, and how Islam might play into a role in some of this, too. Before we leave the court system, though, I want to give you a chance to speak to Adina about this because, after this last horrible event, Janara Kayev, one of the members of parliament, said that in the last 18 months, 88 people that were convicted of rape and in some cases rape of minors have been put on parole, which was the same thing that happened with this one attacker outside Bishkek in late September. The court system, is the court, we've heard it's generally lenient, but how do you base parole, for someone like that that's accused of rape and they get parole?
Yes, I think this is actually a very important information that we got from Parliament that was on discussion where he goes and rapes again his victim. And then for the victim, there is no, the inner world is shattered and there is no justice or punishment for the ones who do the wrongs. But with regards to the court system, I think even with this last case of murder, we see that perpetrator, he was a former police and he knew the ways to get through laws so he could get out of punishment. And we see that happening all over the places in Kyrgyzstan, where the way how the system operates and the way how they manage rape and gender-based violence cases only allow these perpetrators to come back and repeat their actions all over again. Because for them, apparently there is always a way to get through law and get out of punishment, legally and socially speaking.
Yeah, can I add something?
Of course, please.
There is obviously some sort of a collusion that I see within the system because the policemen are mostly men, judges are either men or women that grew up in this, in this narrative that, have adopted this idea of normalizing the violence against women and girls, of normalizing or disregarding the fact that, a rape is a crime and it has to be punished accordingly. And so it's tricky. It's tricky to change this mindset, but in order to change this narrative, there has to be work there is work that needs to be done. The other problem that we have been able to identify is basically a lack of, there is no scorecard for the states. Something that would allow the activists and the international community to basically measure the progress that the state is making in addressing this issue. There is like no way to measure it. The current system of reporting by the states, it's very loose, and they can, basically provide a paragraph or two paragraphs of some sort of a text that wouldn't contain any concrete statistics or wouldn't be sort of like in a form of an application of sorts, where they would actually have a question and a clear answer that needs to be given. Yes, no, how many cases were prosecuted, how many perpetrators have been punished, what are the end results, and so on. But what I know our colleagues are working on currently with the CEDAW committee, actually, is they are developing an optional protocol that would include these mechanisms, and hopefully, something that would help the states to actually make, some progress in terms of addressing this issue.
Okay, thank you. And a reminder, we're talking about the recent deeply disturbing incidents of violence against women and girls in Kyrgyzstan and the failure of authorities to take adequate measures to prevent this violence. And my guests are Adina Masalbekova, a Bishkek-based independent researcher focusing on China's engagement with Central Asia. And Adina has worked previously with the Shanghai Academy of Social Science, the Australian National University, Global Partners Governance, and the Center for European Security Studies and OSCE Academy. Leila Seiitbek is a lawyer living in exile in Europe. Leila is the chairwoman of the NGO Freedom for Eurasia and a member of the Working Group for the Global Treaty to End All Forms of Violence against Women and Girls. And Aksana Ismailbekova, a research fellow at the Leibniz-Zentrum-Moderner Orient. Her research work focuses on kinship, migration, ethnicity, patronage, conflict, and gender in Kyrgyzstan. Thank you again for being on the show, everybody. All right, we're talking about the latest cases, but we could list practically every year. It seems like there's something outrageous happening, right? We had Burulay Turdali Kezi in 2018 killed while put in a police holding facility with her attacker or a would-be kidnapper. There was the woman that was filmed with a tire hanging around her neck and her hands tied behind her back while her husband abused her. That came out in 2020. Aksana Ismailbekova, 2021, kidnapped in downtown Bishkek with the aim of marrying her off and bride kidnapping, and found dead on the outskirts of Bishkek along with her attacker, who then committed suicide. Every time this stuff happens, people are outraged, and yet they just don't seem to be taking effective action. I mean, the examples I've listed are from, going back to when Jan Bekup was the president, and it goes back even before that. So it's not certainly not the result of one administration. I mean, this has been happening consistently again and again. What is failing here with all these? What happens to the public outrage? Does it fade away that quickly? I'll start with you, Aksana.
It's good that you mentioned previous cases, because we still remember all the cases, especially this video of a woman beating a woman by putting a pair of car tires around her neck. And this case has caused a great response in Kyrgyzstan. And yet some of us yet forgot this case, and this happens constantly on a regular basis. Good thing is that we have social media, and thanks to social media, we still learn more about these cases. And I would even encourage people to speak about domestic violence on social media, sharing individual experiences that can make a difference or help bring attention to the issue. In my understanding, that I think we don't have, there are a lack of NGOs that are working with gender issues in the remote regions of Kyrgyzstan. There are really good NGOs working in urban areas, in Osh or in Bishkek, but we see that lack of NGOs in the rural area, and these are very important. And since women don't have alternative, like they cannot rely on the state, they don't have this institution who they would rely, for example, on NGOs. So they turn to institutions that work, and in this case, kinship or extended networks remain kind of stable for them, and that's why they keep rely on these informal institutions. So, and I think I would suggest to revive already existing Zhensavet, this women's consulate, because during the Soviet time they were so good, and people, I think the state should really work together with the Zhensavet and open a lot of medical units, medpunkt, and there are a lot of work has to be done at the local level. Especially, it would be nice to have more psychological support centers focusing on women's mental health, providing information how to access to legal assistance. So these are very essential to create a safer or supportive environment for women in Kyrgyzstan at the moment.
Great, thank you. Adina, what about and like I said, some of this outrage too, but if you could also speak about some of the organizations that could help out. But, when these things happen, you hear deputies and other officials, calling out for stricter punishment, even the death penalty in some cases. Yet, like I said, I just read off a list, and practically every year there was something outrageous, and that's only one example of many. What happens?
What we also can see is that with this, not just with the cases, even with the attempts of civil activists and victims of domestic and gender violence, the attempts to bring the general attention to the public, to the state, they were being met violently. Now they are completely shut down, and there is no even now it's not even allowed to go on any on protests. What we also see is that in some cases, these attempts by activists, they are narrated by the state as some gay propaganda, that, they're fighting for this Western rotten values, which also did not make sense, because gender-based violence, we see it's happening all across the world. It's not, and it has nothing to do with LGBT community. But then all these attempts, they're also being suppressed by the government, which is also a huge, huge problem, because then the information is not delivered in a right way by the official civil servants and by the official discourse. And I think this is for the civil society. Now it takes courage to keep fighting, because we've seen that in the past, during the 8th of March, during the protest and peaceful marches, there were women seized by the police and brought to the interrogations. And I think this is also very important, that the state supports, at least partially, these efforts that try to talk about these important issues.
Okay, thank you. And Leila, I want to get your views on this too, but I also want to shift over to the new government, the new authorities, President Sadr Japarov and his crew. There was a case. It's been ongoing for a couple of years now, but a couple months ago, the Constitutional Court ruled in favor of a woman called Altan Kapalova, and she wanted to use the matronymic, not the patronymic, for her children, because she said the fathers had never been around, hadn't paid any alimony, had never shown any interest in the children. So she wanted to use the matronymic and give them her name. Now, and just to be clear on this was the Russian thing, right? I mean, she, as far as I know, she didn't want her children to be someone, Altin Kizi or Altin Ulu or something. It was just the Russian one, the Russian name that she was looking to use for. And yet, the head of the security committee, Kamchibek Tashiev, objected to this on Facebook. We objected to the Constitutional Court's ruling that she would be able to do that. And of course, Sadr Japarov, since then, there's been legislation that changed the constitutional order again, so that Sadr Japarov, the president, can actually overrule the Constitutional Court on this. I mean, what kind of message is this sending to society? They seem to actually be supporting, keeping women's role to a bare minimum.
Yeah, I also think that this was a pretext for the authorities to finally do this, reform of constitutional court to allow themselves to basically override or overhaul the decisions of the Constitutional Court that they don't like, or somehow overlook, and it comes out and they realize it's not a good decision for them. So basically, it gave them an opportunity to give themselves the authority to influence and control the Constitutional Court's decisions. In terms of the statement of Tashiev in regards to the matronymic, it's quite interesting that the head of the National Security Agency would even actually speak out on that. Because this is not an issue of national security. Again, it's really just a patriarchal narrative that is speaking up. There have been also statements by the parliament members and also by some of the government officials. I think Idil Baisalov has also said something similar, that publication or publishing or speaking up on any platform about the issue of violence against women and girls is damaging. Then they want to somehow prevent and stifle these voices. They want to prevent this information from being disseminated. They want to prevent the discussion around the topic. And I think that's kind of my opinion at this moment, that the entire attitude of current Kyrgyz authorities, but also really the previous administrations as well, I think there are other things that are influencing this. It's a general rollback on human rights. It's a general effort by the authorities to suppress the voices, to limit the freedoms, to to take back the rights of the people, and limit the society in its ability to express itself or enjoy some rights. And we have to also remember that women in Kyrgyzstan is actually a half of the population. So when you keep a half of the population repressed and silent, I would say that for anybody who is looking to consolidate his power and strengthen the authoritarianism, of course, it's beneficial when a half of the population is silent.
Okay, thank you. And that is a great way for me to transition into my next topic for Aksana. A question for you. Now, I think you've even written about the percentage of women in government, right? I mean, according to the Constitution, 30% of the seats in parliament are supposed to be women. And that hasn't been true for like a long, long time. But there's also been information recently, I think 24KG published an article that shows that women aren't present at very many levels in the regional administrations, district administrations, in local police forces. They're not the heads of local police forces. How much does that hurt? I mean, clearly women's problems would be heard at least a little more clearly if there was more representation of women in government.
Thank you for the great question, and I will like to link this your question with the previous point that Leila has raised concerning that how Kyrgyz government or Kyrgyzstan is a quite patriarchal society, which I agree. And with the case of Altan Kapala, we see that state has reproduced male dominance. So, as we know, this there has been a lot of as a scholar, I can say that in patriarchal societies, women also have their own agency. They can really find ways and to exercise their agency by under the umbrella that they might be suppressed or silenced, but nevertheless, they have their own ways of showing their power, but probably not in an invisible way. This one thing, and second comes to the point concerning this. I know a lot of really great women. They were offered a position at a high state level, but nevertheless they decided not to accept these positions, mainly because partially of care responsibilities. Children and family might not prefer that women keep working for a long time, and then they would be blamed for not taking children. But at the second time, they also some of the women didn't want to serve for the men when they start working in the state administration. So I would see this kind of is one way of resistance, that they don't want to work with these men. And rather, a lot of really great activist women were quite happy working for NGOs, where they would feel really they had their own agency and they can really make impact. Because working for the state, they really have to speak the language of the state authorities, convince them, find a nice way of dealing with them, and a lot of brilliant women that I spoken, they just refused of accepting state positions due to this dominance that they constantly face. But rather, they would prefer to be quite independent and work for NGOs or other works, like being teachers or for the Zhensovet.
Okay, thank you. We're coming close to the end, so I'm going to give everyone a chance for last comments. But also, if you could mention what sort of social safety net do women and girls have in Kyrgyzstan outside the legal system? I mean, what kind of organizations are out there, NGOs or local organizations that could possibly help, especially if women have a legal problem and want the law to actually be enforced when there's a ruling against ex-husbands or ex-boyfriends or current husbands or boyfriends. Adina?
Unfortunately, I cannot give a list, but I know that there are crisis centers that operate, but there is also a problem where, the activists I previously spoke with, they would mention that the crisis centers, they give shelter to women and to kids, but then there's a problem where they keep on accepting new people, new victims, and then some women who lived there for a bit longer time, then they had to leave. So that's another problem where crisis centers, they only serve as something temporary, but they're not even solving or preventing the issue at all. And I think another problem that we have is especially with rape cases. Recently, there was a case with a girl who was assaulted by a taxi driver, and then she went to the police and she couldn't even report about the real case, so she lied about the driver stealing her phone because she was ashamed to report about the assault case, the sexual assault case. And I think it's very important to also talk about sexual education, about educating especially young people about their rights, and about the fact that they, if they're sexually or somehow harassed, they have a right to report, and there is no shame in that. And I think it's extremely important that victims, they are aware that there is no shame in that. But unfortunately, it's something that is happening all over the places, and they feel even more guilt for challenging these things.
Okay, thank you. Leila?
I can't really say the names of the organization right off the top of my head, but there are organizations in Kyrgyzstan that run shelters for victims of domestic and sexual violence, and they also can refer the woman to lawyers that specialize in cases of sexual violence and domestic violence as well. And they have already been able to collect some experience on how to handle these. But I guess my recommendation to women would be, and I do tell that to the women that we are in touch with on ground, that they should continue going to the professionals that are supposed to be doing this job. And although at this time it's not bringing the results that they are supposed to produce, these efforts should not stop. The process has to continue. And unfortunately, we do have these tragic cases, such as with the recent case that you have mentioned, where a husband, a former police officer, has mutilated his ex-wife, after numerous efforts by her to appeal to the police and the courts. I'm afraid we will have more cases in the future. I don't think this is the last case, unfortunately. And I do think that it's very important, as Aksana has mentioned, to engage the religious leaders in this work. And I hope the authorities will maybe change their mind and eventually will agree to engage more of the society into solving this issue, because obviously the suppression of freedoms might be of an interest, but the situation of women, and actually the violence against women and girls, is actually something that is a factor in country having very big economic problems, because it causes losses. It actually causes huge financial losses to the state. And when they start understanding that, I think maybe that will help them. Maybe that will help them to start taking steps towards finding some solutions that are already there. They don't even need to be invented. It's already all there. They just need to use existing materials that are already produced by the experts in the field.
Okay, thank you. Aksana, you get the last word.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to raise important issue, which is the role of Islamic activists, female activists, especially their role in preventing such crises, and they have been really effective, even even better than the state can provide. And they took the social welfare activities of the state. For example, the role of Mutakalim, Islamic organizations, they have been the only one that could challenge imams and deal with them and asking them to speak and raise the issue of women's rights in the mosques. And they are the ones who really raise domestic violence publicly, and they have their own social media in Facebook and in Instagram. They also raise these issues monthly, and I think, but unfortunately, they are very limited. This kind of Islamic organizations that really focus on women's rights, and I think if more NGOs and Islamic organizations work together on common values like protecting the rights of women, I think it would be really good, effective tool, I think, for women to help them to solve their problems.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for being on the program. I know it's a tough topic. I'm sure we're going to come back to this in the future, and I would be happy to have you all as guests on the program. So thank you, Leila and Aksana and Adina, for being on the program. And a big thanks, as always, to Nathan Shoemaker, our Majlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C., and a reminder, you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thank you much. We'll be back next week. Bye-bye.